The studio was set. The warm glow of the lights cast a cinematic ambiance over the iconic Joe Rogan Experience setup. 2 microphones, 2 cups of coffee, and a looming ideological battle that had already ignited a firestorm online. This wasn't just another podcast. This was a collision of 2 worldviews. Joe Rogan, known for his open-mindedness and ability to challenge guests, leaned back in his chair. Carolina Levitt wasn't just any guest. She wasn't a comedian, a UFC fighter, or a longevity guru. She was a firebrand in the world of political discourse, a woman whose ideas both inspired and enraged. Ever since her name was announced for this episode, the internet had been ablaze. Libertarians and free market advocates were hyped, ready for Joe to dismantle her arguments. Progressives and socialists were convinced she would expose the flaws of capitalism. Joe adjusted his headphones, took a deep breath, and smiled at his guest. This was it. The debate was about to begin. Joe, ever the seasoned interviewer, kept his posture relaxed. His approach was simple: make the guest feel comfortable, at least at first. Carolina, first off, welcome to the podcast. Carolina nodded, offering a composed smile. Her demeanor was calm, but her presence was commanding. She wasn't the kind of guest who would get flustered under pressure. Thanks for having me, Joe. Joe leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. The first punch was coming. So let's get straight to it. You advocate for a system where the government plays a bigger role in the economy, right? But every time we see too much government intervention, things go south. Do you really believe politicians know how to run the economy better than the free market? It was a classic challenge, one that had been used in countless debates. But Carolina didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the predictability of the question. Joe, the problem with that question is that it assumes we have only 2 choices. Either the market is completely free, or the government controls everything. The reality is far more nuanced. The market can function, but only within fair rules that prevent exploitation and extreme inequality. Joe raised an eyebrow. Interesting. She didn't take the bait. But see, he countered, every time the government gets too involved, we see bureaucracy, corruption, inefficiency, and businesses, they flee to places with lower taxes. If we start taxing the rich too much, they'll just leave. Carolina exhaled, leaning forward slightly. This was the moment she had been waiting for. If a billionaire can just pack up and move to another country to avoid paying fair taxes, doesn't that already prove the system is broken? What does it say when a middle-class worker pays a higher tax rate than a billionaire? That's not a free market, Joe, that's rigged. Joe pressed his lips together, processing her words. So what's the solution? The government deciding how much everyone can make? Carolina smirked. It was the perfect setup for her counter-argument. It's not about capping wealth, Joe. If someone builds something great, they should be rewarded. But let's be real. Most of today's wealth isn't coming from innovation. It's coming from monopolies, tax loopholes, and financial games. Banks crash the economy and get bailed out, while small businesses get crushed. That's not capitalism. That's corporate welfare. Joe rubbed his chin. That was a tough one. Okay, but let's talk about the Nordic countries you often mention. They have a relatively free market. They privatized industries. They encourage investment. They're not exactly the socialist paradise some people think. Carolina tilted, her head slightly, her expression unwavering. And yet they still guarantee universal healthcare, education, and a high quality of life. If a free market was enough, why does the US, the richest country in the world, have millions of people without healthcare? One accident can bankrupt a family. How is that freedom? Joe let out a chuckle, shaking his head. She was good. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. But there's a difference, Carolina. These are small, homogeneous countries. You can't compare a place with 5 million people to the US. Trying to regulate everything here would be a bureaucratic nightmare. Carolina exhaled, her confidence unshaken. So you're admitting the problem isn't the size of government, it's the structure of the US economy? Nordic countries show that capitalism can work with regulations that protect people. What's stopping us from doing the same? Joe opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. He wasn't sure he had a good answer for that. The conversation had only just begun, but the tension was already thick. Both sides were throwing punches, and neither was backing down. Joe adjusted his seat, taking a sip of coffee, preparing for the next round. Carolina kept her gaze locked, ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just another debate. This was a war of ideologies, and it was far from over. The tension in the studio was already palpable. Joe Rogan wasn't used to being on the defensive this early in a debate. He usually controlled the pace, but Carolina Levitt was a different kind of guest. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't scrambling for words. She was winning. Joe took a deep breath, cracking his knuckles lightly as he shifted in his chair. If Carolina wanted a fight, she was about to get one. He took a sip of his coffee before launching into his next argument. This was the one that always worked. All right, Carolina, you've made some fair points about inequality, but let's be real for a second. Capitalism, despite its flaws, has done more to lift people out of poverty than any other system in history. If you look at the data, billions of people have escaped extreme poverty thanks to free markets and innovation. Isn't that proof that the system works? Carolina didn't even blink. She had heard this argument 1,000 times before. Tilting her head slightly, she responded with the same calm, razor-sharp confidence that had already put Joe on edge. Works for who, Joe? Because sure, extreme poverty has decreased worldwide, but where did most of that happen? China, a country that lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty through government intervention, heavy regulation, and state-driven economic planning. If anything, that proves that markets alone don't fix poverty. Strong policy does. Joe chuckled, shaking his head. Come on, you're really going to use China as an example of a successful model? A country with mass surveillance, no free speech, and a totalitarian regime. That's not exactly what I'd call a beacon of economic justice. Carolina leaned forward, her eyes locked on him. I'm not saying China is the model for freedom, Joe. I'm saying that their government actively took measures to lift people out of poverty instead of waiting for trickle-down economics to magically fix things. And let's not forget, the wealth gap in the US has been widening for decades. The rich are richer than ever while wages for most Americans have stagnated. Meanwhile, billionaires are flying to space while millions struggle to afford rent. Tell me, how is that proof that capitalism is working? Joe exhaled through his nose, adjusting his position in the chair. He wasn't used to feeling this cornered. He had debated experts before, but Carolina wasn't just knowledgeable. She was relentless. Okay, he said, nodding slightly. But let's talk about opportunity. America is still the best place in the world for upward mobility. You see people coming here with nothing and becoming millionaires. That's the dream, right? You don't get that in places with heavy government control. Carolina smiled knowingly. The American dream, huh? Do you know, it's funny how people always talk about rags to riches stories as if they're common. But statistically, they're not. Social mobility in the US is actually lower than in many European countries. If you're born poor here, chances are you'll stay poor. And if you're born rich, you'll stay rich. That's not a free market rewarding hard work. That's generational wealth keeping power in the hands of the few. Joe ran a hand over his shaved head, his signature look of contemplation mixed with frustration. So what's your solution? More taxes? More government handouts? You really think that's going to create more prosperity? Carolina's voice didn't waver. I think the people who benefit the most from this system should contribute their fair share. Billionaires aren't self-made. They use public infrastructure. They rely on workers who were educated in public schools. They benefit from government-funded research, and yet they pay lower tax rates than the average teacher or firefighter. That's not just unfair, it's robbery. Joe leaned back, crossing his arms. All right, but if you start taxing the rich too much, they're just going to leave. That's what happens every time. Businesses move to lower tax countries, and then what? The jobs disappear, and the economy suffers. Carolina shook her head. That argument assumes that billionaires are the only ones creating jobs. But the truth is, small and medium-sized businesses are the backbone of the economy, not multinational corporations hoarding wealth offshore. And let's be real, Most of these ultra-rich people aren't job creators. They're wealth hoarders. They don't reinvest in the economy. They sit on their billions while workers fight for scraps. Joe let out a slow breath. The energy in the room had shifted. He could feel the weight of the discussion pressing on him. He had expected resistance, but this wasn't just a debate. It was a dismantling. Carolina wasn't just countering his points. She was exposing cracks in the system he had always believed in. The studio was silent for a moment, the air thick with unspoken tension. Then Joe, in a rare moment of vulnerability, ran a hand over his mouth, hesitated, and said something no one expected. "I used to be in love with you." Carolina blinked. The sudden shift in tone caught her off guard. "What?" Joe let out a quiet, almost embarrassed laugh. "Years ago, before you became who you are now, I admired you in a different way. You weren't this revolutionary force back then. I don't know, maybe I thought you saw the world more like I did. But now, listening to you, I realize you've changed. Or maybe you've always thought this way, and I just didn't see." To her, Carolina's expression softened, but only slightly. "Joe, I've always cared about justice. Maybe you just didn't notice until now." Joe looked down for a second before meeting her gaze again. The fire was still there, but something else had crept into his eyes. Uncertainty. He wasn't sure if he was losing the debate or something deeper, and just like that, the conversation had shifted. It was no longer just about economics. It was about something else, something neither of them was ready to fully confront. The debate wasn't over, but now it had become personal. Joe Rogan sat in silence for a moment, drumming, his fingers against the wooden table. The energy in the room had shifted. The debate was no longer just about economics or capitalism versus government intervention. There was something deeper brewing, something unsaid, lingering in the spaces between their words. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to collect his thoughts. He wasn't used to losing control of a conversation, especially on his own show. He had gone toe-to-toe with intellectuals, politicians, and even conspiracy theorists, but Carolina Levitt wasn't just a guest. She was a force. "You know," he finally said, his voice quieter than before, "I used to be in love with you." Carolina's head tilted slightly. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and amusement. "What?" Joe let out a short chuckle, rubbing a hand over his face. "Not literally, but back in the day, before you were this, I admired you in a way I haven't admired a lot of people. You weren't just brilliant, you were fearless. I guess I thought you saw the world the same way I did." He paused, looking at her like he was searching for something. "Maybe I thought we were on the same team." Carolina's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but for the first time in the conversation, she hesitated. That threw her off. She had spent the entire debate countering every argument with precision, deflecting every attack effortlessly. But this was unexpected. She folded her hands together on the table, watching him carefully. "Joe, I've never been on a different team than you. I've just never believed in the illusion that this system works the way they tell us it does." Joe smirked, shaking his head. "I don't know, Carolina. It feels like you're looking at me like I'm just another guy defending the billionaires, the elites, the corrupt politicians." "Are you?" she asked, her voice softer now. Joe exhaled, looking away for a second before bringing his eyes back to her. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I don't want to admit that you have a point." Carolina leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make the moment feel heavier. "Joe, I don't think you're the enemy, but I do think you've spent a long time defending a system that doesn't actually care about you either." That hit deeper than he expected. His jaw tightened as he processed her words. He had built his entire career on challenging authority, questioning narratives, and refusing to be boxed into one ideology. And yet, sitting across from her, he felt something unraveling. Like maybe, just maybe, he had been on the wrong side of something without even realizing it. Carolina studied him carefully. "You said you admired me back then. Do you admire me now?" Joe let out a breath, looking down at the coffee cup in front of him before lifting his eyes back to her. His answer came slower this time. "Yeah," he admitted, "I do." For a few seconds, the two of them just sat there, the weight of the moment pressing between them. The debate had taken a turn neither of them expected. This wasn't just about politics anymore. And for the first time since the conversation started, Joe Rogan wasn't sure if he wanted to win. Joe shifted in his chair, gripping his coffee cup a little tighter than before. The studio, which had felt like his domain, now felt smaller, like the walls were closing in just slightly. Carolina wasn't just winning the debate, she was shifting something inside him. That admission, that reluctant acknowledgement that he still admired her, had cracked open something he wasn't sure he wanted exposed, but the conversation wasn't over yet, and he wasn't the type to just fold. "All right," he said, exhaling as if resetting himself. "But let's bring this back to reality. You're making all these points about inequality, about how the system is rigged. Fine, but what's your endgame here? You want higher taxes on the rich, more government programs? Then what? Where does it stop? You start giving people too much and you kill innovation. You take away incentives and the economy crashes. You think billionaires are greedy now. Wait until you try to force them to share." Carolina watched him closely, nodding slightly, as if waiting for him to finish his thoughts before striking. "Joe, I need you to hear me on this. No one is talking about taking away innovation. The people who are actually innovative, the scientists, the engineers, the creators, those people are the ones being underpaid while executives sit in boardrooms moving money around. Do you really think Elon Musk alone built Tesla? Or that Jeff Bezos packed every Amazon box himself? They got rich off the labor of other people. And yet, they act like they did it all on their own." Joe rubbed his hands together, a nervous tick. He hadn't realized he was doing. "So what, we just take their money? Hand it out to everyone?" Carolina leaned in, her voice measured, deliberate. "No, Joe. We invest it. We build infrastructure. We fund education. We make sure people don't have to work 3 jobs just to survive. We create an economy where success isn't just reserved for those who already had a head start." Joe scoffed, shaking his head. "That sounds great in theory, but what happens when you run out of other people's money?" Carolina smirked. "Funny how we never ask that question. When it comes to military spending, bank bailouts, or corporate subsidies, it's only when regular people need help that suddenly we're concerned about running out of money." Joe opened his mouth, then shut it. He had a response. He always had a response. But right now, nothing he said felt like it would be enough. She had an answer for everything, and worse, her answers made sense. The silence between them grew heavier. It wasn't an awkward silence, it was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniably present. Joe looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time in years. "You've changed," he finally said. Carolina tilted her head slightly. "Or maybe I've just finally said the things I was too polite to say before." Joe chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, maybe." He tapped the table lightly, staring at his coffee. "You know, I don't lose arguments often on this show." Carolina grinned. "Maybe you should invite better opponents." Joe laughed, a real laugh. This time and let out a long breath. "All right, you got me." He looked back at her, something softer in his expression now. "You're not wrong about a lot of this, but I still think people need to have the freedom to make their own way." Carolina nodded. "And I think freedom means more than just the ability to make money. It means not having to choose between paying rent or buying food. It means healthcare that won't bankrupt you. It means knowing that no matter what zip code you're born in, you have a shot at something better." Joe sat back in his chair, staring at her for a long moment. Then finally, he nodded. "You make a damn good argument, Levitt." Carolina smiled. "I know." Joe turned toward the camera, rubbing his face before exhaling dramatically. "All right, folks, that was a hell of a conversation. I don't know what side you're on, but I do know that I just got my ass kicked." Carolina chuckled, sitting back in her chair. "First time for everything." Joe laughed, shaking his head. Yeah. All right, tell me where people can find you." She gave her social media plugs, and as the cameras turned off, the energy in the room shifted again. The debate was over, but the tension wasn't. Joe looked at her as she adjusted her microphone, a lingering thought in his mind. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "if things had been different, maybe we'd be having a different conversation." Carolina paused, looking at him for a beat longer than necessary. Then she smiled, but it wasn't just amusement, it was something else, something unspoken. "Maybe," she said simply, and with that she stood up, grabbing her jacket. "Good talk, Rogan." Joe watched her walk away, exhaling as he leaned back in his chair. The conversation was over, but something told him he'd be thinking about it for a long time.